that's a problem. But
And
don't punish them
I think Dennis
anymore
is on his
if
way
you-
down.
Thank you,
And
guys.
this is a meeting of the Enterprise Committee, and we're here to discuss solid waste services and what issues we're looking at and what options we might be discussing. Oh, go around too, yeah.
Adam Trombley.
Amy Domboski.
Tim Steele. Bernie Hall.
Jennifer Johnson?
Chris Birch.
George Michaelis.
Dennis Mandel.
Lucinda Mahoney. Okay, the reason why we asked to have this enterprise committee is because we wanted to talk with all of you in a discussion-oriented manner about the future financial viability of the collection portion of SWS. So this is the portion where of the business where we have the trucks going around in our area and collecting trash, bringing it to the central station, and then transporting it out to the landfill. Okay, that's the type of business that we're talking about. If you recall, some of you, not all of you were here, like Amy and Tim, but during the fall budget process, what we did was we looked at where we are with the refuse utility in regard to its net income and its capital. And then we also did a 5-year forecast. And that is the very first page of the document that you have in front of you. And at that time, we all had talked about, and there was a recognition that as we move forward in a flat rate environment, the net income of that utility goes negative in 2015. And then it continues to worsen, and we end up eating into our equity and our cash in regard to funding this utility. We would, if we do nothing, we would be in a situation similar to what we are in right now with Fund 181, where its revenues do not cover its expenses. So part of our job is to look at, where are we today and what are our options going forward into the future in regard to this utility. So as you look at this, you can see that doing nothing is not really a choice. Doing nothing means we essentially drive this into the ground. We have another option, which would be to increase the rates. If we increase the rates, we would increase the revenues. But the question is would we ever be able to really increase the revenues such that we would be able to cover our capital investment on this utility, which today we are not able to do. Another option would be to contract this out and go into like a 5-year type outsourcing contract, managed competition contract, something of that magnitude. It's an industry practice that's going on in the lower 48. And in fact, we had an offer from JL Properties some time back to do something similar with this utility at that time. And then the last and final option would be to just sell the asset. And so internally, as we were looking at what are the various choices that we have for this utility, one of the very first questions was, well, if we went to the very last scenario, which would be to sell the asset, is there even any value in it? I mean, with a negative net income and the way a typical valuation is done, which is cash is king, would it even have any value? And so with that, what we decided to do was hire Dennis Mandel, and he is sitting right next to me, to evaluate, is there even any value in this particular asset, and what would be the potential if we would decide to sell it? So the objective of this meeting today is to just share with you our thoughts, the options that we are looking at in regard to this particular asset, and over the next 2-3 months, get your input and ideas and thoughts about what should we do with this asset. The intent is to be very collaborative, open, and discussion-oriented. So with that, what I want to do is introduce Dennis. He was here helping us with 2 projects. One is the NSTAR project in terms of settling that negotiation, which we did yesterday successfully, and also to provide an update on this project here, So because he was in town, we thought we would open this up and he would share his findings with you in regard to just one piece of the analysis. I want to reiterate that everything that we are looking at this point is very preliminary. No decisions have been made, and we are just sharing information. So Dennis Mandel works with Mako Strategies. He is out of the San Francisco area, and he has over 30 years experience doing financial analytics and business valuations. He spent a significant amount of time working in the oil industry, doing really very, very large business valuations with expert testimony and doing a lot of litigation reports. So with that, I thought what I would do is just turn this over to Dennis, and he would just share with you what he's identified in terms of really just looking at the numbers in regard to this asset. And then from there, what we could do is just talk about some steps going forward. And with that, I'll introduce Dennis.
Thank you, and I appreciate your time to be here. Let me take, the sheet you have in front of you is an accounting-oriented sheet. And so I'm gonna have to do a little bit of translation into investment banking world so that we can put the value to this. And I'm just gonna make a couple adjustments. If you look at 2013 and you look at the expenses of $9 million, that includes about $800,000 of depreciation. When you evaluate something, we're interested in what really goes into the bank account. So we make the immediate adjustment of reducing those expenses down to about $8.2 million, which would give you what we call an operating cash flow of about $1.2 million. So this entity right now is generating about $1.2 million in operating cash flow, ignoring all the balance sheet, things like that. It's an important number because I want to make sure we reflect the true value, and if we went out and valued this, what we're going to do with this, we really want to reflect the best part of this company. The other metrics that we use in our industry is the interrelationship between that $1.2 million. Sometimes you've heard the term EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That's a metrics that's commonly used in the stock world. And you're going to see it in my presentation, so when you see it, that's really operating cash flow is an easier way to look at that number. And that metrics in your case for SWS is 13%. That's an important number because I'm going to compare you to the industry and show where you metrics against the industry. This is just like a performance analysis type of thing. The other thing important on this sheet is the capital program is about $1.7 million. You can see that on the number down there, so that you're expecting to, from a cash flow standpoint, be a drain of about $400,000. I just want you to, I'm going to translate this now into my world. Please, if you have any questions, stop me. I'm very interactive. If something doesn't, because a lot of this is going to be just terminology. I'm going to take it very, very slow. If you go to the next page, page 2, as Lucinda said, you asked me from an investment banking standpoint to put what we call a fair value. Some people call it fair market value, some people call it fair value. This is a very unique asset. This isn't like valuing the Midas muffler down the street. This is a very, very unique asset. So there's a number of adjustments I have to make in this thing, but you've asked me to put a fair value on it, and this is what I have done. As Lucinda just said, it doesn't take a lot to look at these numbers on the negative income and the required cash flow to show you that this, on an annual basis, is going to require cash. You're going to be drawing down your capital reserves. So the first statement I have in here, in conclusion of value, based on cash flow, is that in almost every case I look at, this has a negative cash flow. I want to caution you of something. I just got done valuing a software company, or better yet, HP's acquisition of Autonomy. Negative cash flow, but it got 10 times revenue in its valuation. So another way that we look sometimes at valuation is not on cash flow. There's a lot of different ways to view an asset. And when we look at this asset, the expenses may not be reflective of the value of the asset in itself. So another way that we look at this is potentially look at it as a multiple of revenue. And I want to point out to you that we like to look at what comparable things have gone on. One of the comparable things that just occurred here was a company called Waste Connections' acquisition of Alaska Waste. It was a very private deal, but if you kind of work your way through the financial blogs out there, it was bought, based on my estimation, at about 2 times revenue. So it was a pretty, that's a healthy multiple in this industry, but a nice multiple they got. One concern I have is that when I compare your operations, your EBITDA, your margin, remember I said it was 13% versus your industry, your growth against the industry, you are lagging behind the industry in this sector. And that's an important point. And anybody who is going to be a purchaser of this will look at the same numbers I'm going to be looking at and will discount you back based on those types of metrics. So this is really my conclusion, 3 things. One, discounted cash flow is going to give us a negative number, and that's not going to be beneficial. You're lagging behind the industry metrics, but if we were to sell you on a revenue basis, it clearly has value. This organization has value. It has a ticket for a long-term revenue generation. That's what a lot of people like, steady income flow. So this does have value, it's not negative, but I want to make sure that we understand the differences. If you look at your financial results specifically, I looked at 2012 versus 2011 because I like to look at what actually has occurred. These are some of the metrics that we look at when we look at these things. Now, let me just caution you one thing. My view on value is it's an piece of art. You're painting a picture of something where an appraiser, like we did with NSTAR's settlement yesterday, we had to come up to a number, and the number has to go in a box. I'm giving you a picture of what I see here rather than putting a number specifically in a box. 2 different worlds that we're dealing. Yesterday was dealing in number in the box. Today I'm dealing with trying to paint a picture of what I think this thing is worth. And it has different characteristics. These are the metrics that we would look at. You know, basically, your revenue has year over year has been fairly flat. And that's consistent because you haven't had necessarily the rate increases. Your tonnage that you're moving is actually declining. Your operating earnings, operating cash flow, your EBITDA, whatever name you want to put on it, year over year actually declined by about 6%, primarily because your direct costs and your allocated costs went up by 6 to 7%. You had capital spending. Your capital spending went up by about $2 million, and your cash flow from this thing went down about $2 million. At the end, I'm just trying to, as I look at the operation, these are very important metrics, and then when I look out down you, I begin to see that expenses clearly, and you see this right in the front, expenses are exceeding revenues. You've got a choice, either increasing your revenues or dealing with your expenses. Again, stop me if any of this doesn't, especially terminology here. Historical, when we look at operations, we don't just look at year over year. We like to look at year over year, that's your first column. We also like to go back 3 years, because that reflects, it's traditional in my industry to look back 3 years. But I thought in this case, it was actually more advantageous to look at you over 5 years, because that would reflect what we call the regulatory environment, kind of like what we did yesterday with NSTAR. We would want to go back over a 5-year period, because your rate changes are regulated, so we want to look at a much broader spectrum. So if you look at that spectrum, your growth in revenue is about 1.1 on a 3-year and 4% on a 5-year. Those are important metrics that we would look at. Your EBITDA growth in almost every category is negative, and almost in every category of your direct costs and your allocated costs, they're increasing. What we do now is I try to estimate where you're going to be in 2013. In my mind, in 2013, when I sat earlier this year, I figured you'd make in the revenue stream of about $8 million to $9 million. The new budgets that Lucinda just shows a 9.4. So you're a little higher than what my estimate. And again, this is sort of like a stock, guy given an estimate of a stock. This is where I was pegging you on revenue. I was pegging you on revenue about break even to $1 million. You're at about $1 million. Your capital spending is actually, I was pegging you about $1 million to $2 million. You're at about $1.6 million. And I was estimating your operating cash flow either between break even or $2 million. You're at about $400,000 negative. So you were within my range. And again, in all these cases, using the forward projections of either year over year, 3 years, or 5 years, in all of the cases from a value, from a discounted cash flow value, where it's taking the cash flow out and bringing it back to today, and I used a 5% discount rate because this is a utility type of model. Very low risk. And this isn't like as compared to, say, Twitter, that has subject to high volatility, and this is a low volatility type of, it's like N-Star, low volatility, steady type of thing, earnings, so it would constitute a very low discount rate. But in all cases, it was negative. So that would, again, even in all three scenarios, you were negative. Next page, numbers don't mean anything unless they're compared against something. They really in and themselves mean nothing. There are two major leaders in this industry. One is waste management. Waste management is the giant in the whole waste industry. These people are everywhere, except for San Francisco, San Mateo, up here. But they give us good metrics on what they do. I've also included Waste Connections in here. Why? Because they're the acquirer of Alaska Waste. And what I want to show you is that on average, their growth rate is about, well, Waste Management is about 7%, Waste Connections is 15%, and again, even over a 5-year period, you're only at 4%. Now their numbers include increases in tonnages, increases in prices, acquisitions, all that type of thing. But again, trying to look at what the industry is doing and versus how you're performing. Their ratio of operating cash flow, or we call EBITDA to revenue, we want to look at that metrics. Waste Management is at 24%, Waste Connections at 32%, you're at 13%. So you're significantly lower than where the industry has pegged. The other last thing is not relevant necessarily to the presentation. That was more from investment banking. But that's what you really want to focus on, is the 13% margin versus what the industry overall averages between 20 and 30%. So you're significantly below, you're almost half of what the average is in the industry. I just throw the last slide in there. You can, most of you have access to stock information. This is just the basis of the players, the significant players that are in the market, and some of the transactions and the multiples that support the work that I've done.
Patrick?
So the takeaway,
Actually, Patrick, is your question for Dennis? or-
Yeah, just for, well, it's for Dennis and George, but go ahead and wrap up, Lucinda.
okay, I was just gonna say, in regard to the last option that we're evaluating in regard to selling it, after looking at this analysis, if we could convince some buyers to look at it and purchase it using a revenue approach, which would be multiplier revenue, we think we could get potentially 10 to 20 million. And it already has 5 million of cash in the bank, so then that would be potentially 15 to 25 million. So that's just one option in regard to how we could look at managing this going forward. So, and as I mentioned earlier, the other options would be to increase the rates and the revenues, and the other option, look at 5-year contracts. And Dennis actually did some research also in terms of how the 5-year contracts are working on the West Coast. So if you're interested in information about that, in terms of its applicability here, Dennis can answer some of those questions as well. So with that, I'll just be quiet.
Okay, Patrick?
Thank you, Jennifer. My recollection of Alaska Waste's offer to us, which was never formalized, I don't think it was more of a discussion term, was that they would take over the collections piece of solid waste services, and we would retain ownership of the disposal of the landfill, and then they would pay us a rate.
Yes.
My question is, our landfill is currently on federal land, DOD land. That was something, George, I know you were involved with the negotiation years ago. If we sell solid waste services disposal entity, how does that relationship change with the DOD? In other words, are we in a better position because we have a government-to-government relationship than we would if we had a private sector-to-government relationship?
We're not looking at selling the disposal piece at all.
Only the collections?
Only the collections piece. We want to keep the landfill piece, the disposal piece.
Because we like having the liability of care and closure?
I don't think we can sell it.
The original agreement has to be in the public sector, so
Yeah,
it
I
has
don't
to be
think we
owned
can
by a
sell it.
governmental entity.
Okay.
This is, you
So the only thing we're talking,
introduction.
I apologize,
That's
I was
okay.
misled. So the only discussion here is the collections
Yes.
piece? Okay,
Yes.
sorry.
Tim?
Yeah, mine, we're not, the numbers are quite different between us and the private sector, those folks that are doing the same job. The question is, where is it different? Is it different in rates? Is it different in costs? Where's the difference between?
You want to, go ahead, George.
We have depressed rates pretty much in the solid waste service areas. If you look at how it compares with their competition. And in every category, our rates are significantly, and I do say significantly, I'm not exaggerating in that term, below what their rates are in almost just about every single category in the commercial area. The commercial revenues from solid waste services is the bulk of their revenues. They do have residential, but it's the commercial. And when I say commercial, it's the multi-residential, the apartment complexes, it's the hotels, it's also the businesses. So the bulk of their revenue comes from that type of entity. And again, when you compare the revenue potential of solid waste services, it's substantial from what we're actually charging. As you may remember, there was no increase in 2010, and there was no increase in the last budget preparation either for collections. So, in answer to the question, do they have rate capacity and still be competitive in the price range with their competition? Absolutely.
How about in terms of costs? Are these government employees a lot more costly than the private sector employees that are?
Well, I think the answer to that probably is yes, although they're both unionized. One of the things that, of course, has substantially hurt the wages from the standpoint of the increase and making us less competitive, of course, with some of the rate increases that were as a direct result of the contract, the 5-year contract. So those substantially increased the salaries. But whether or not, because we've never run the models to see, you know, how far up the scale and the rates we want to increase. So I don't know what that means overall. But I do know that they have capacity to substantially increase revenues, and we just haven't done it since 2010, since 2010.
I know it
We had
jumped
it.
to being a customer.
We have them in the disposal.
Yeah, we haven't raised the collection fees. We've been raising the landfill fees
These are Teamster employees, right?
Well-
Solid Waste Services, most of them?
and operators.
And those are 3-year contracts.
Yeah, I think, isn't it Teamster and operators?
Well, they've got every union involved.
Yeah, and AMEA.
They have AMEA, they have everyone involved.
It went up substantially when we changed to containers versus curbside bags in terms of the rate. And the cost supposedly went down because we eliminated one person per truck when we went to the automated collection.
Well, the other thing that
We still have the alley issue.
Right, so just to refresh everybody's memory, in solid waste, one of the things that, you know, was orchestrated and approved some time ago was that they would do recycling. And they do not charge for that recycling as opposed to their competition. They do not charge, when they pick up a can, the can cost for that additional can is basically borne by the utility.
Really?
Whereas their competition charges for that extra, is that correct?
No,
that's not
it went up
correct.
substantially.
That's not correct.
I'm here as a private citizen.
So, well, my understanding,
No.
Here, let me help you out.
It doubled.
well, let me give you some numbers.
I am in Solid Waste Services collection area. I pay them a flat fee per month because I'm not in the recycling service area yet. I pay an additional fee to Waste Connections now, Alaska Waste, for them to pick up my recycling. When Solid Waste Services provides curbside service to me, I don't have an alley, then my total bill will shrink, but my bill to Solid Waste Services will grow. So it is an increased cost to have recycling service at curbside.
They just say alternate.
It will.
Well,
Unless I go to the bi-weekly service for trash.
I guess what I'm saying is, if you look at the rates, what they're actually charging for the recycle service compared to Alaska Waste, it's all inclusive. Alaska Waste is a separate charge.
It's all,
Yeah.
no, you have to have it, is the thing.
You have to have it in the solid waste service
Yes.
area.
Yeah.
You have a choice in the other area, but when you select that choice, you're paying for that.
Right, but that's.
But the key is though, I mean, we can talk about rates, this rate, that rate all day long, but I think we need to get bigger picture and think more strategically about how really do we want to manage this long term? Is this the type of business that government should stay in? Or is this something that would be better for the city if we privatize it and we turn it over to the private sector who already manages 2/3 of this in our city as it is?
Adam?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that, because that kind of made my point for the first question I had. The second question I had is for Dennis. When the city sold was it ATU?
Mhm.
ATU took a vote of the people. Is this similar, or can the city dispose of this in a fashion that takes the action of the body? I mean, what is the legal route that has to be taken?
So the answer to that is that the charter back when identified utilities by definition, and it had a certain definition which I don't have with me, but solid waste services at the time of unification didn't fit that definition. So you can make the argument that a vote is not required because it was not defined as a utility.
Is that also why it's not regulated, of course, it's the size?
It has nothing to do with the size, it has to do with the definition of what was and wasn't a utility at the time.
But we set the rates.
Right.
By the regulatory.
It's not RCA regulated, is my
Right.
point.
It's assembly
It is
regulated.
regulated, but the RCA has granted us, the ability to do the regulation.
But it does take a vote.
Does
of-
not.
No, but it does take a vote of the assembly in order to, for the sale to go through. It can't be done administratively.
No, I don't think so. I haven't looked at that. It requires assembly approval, right?
It does require some.
Amy?
Well, my regulatory question just got answered, so thank you. But second, I think a big part of this conversation is to make sure that we have buyers that would be interested. I would be interested in having the administration put out an RFP to see about possible sale or auction, just to see what we're looking at. I think it makes sense.
That was one of the options that we discussed with the mayor a couple of days ago, would be an RFP to solicit interest.
Yeah.
See, is the 10 to 20 million real in this environment?
I think you put it more eloquently than I, but that's where I was going.
Huh?
I have to declare a conflict.
Okay.
My wife represented Waste Connections in their purchase of Alaska Waste assets.
So is the number right? The estimate?
Stay out of my bedroom.
I just got my number from reading all the financial statements.
So I'm probably gonna leave now, because if we're gonna talk about somebody buying our collection service, Waste Connections is definitely gonna be part of that conversation. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to be part of
Okay. I think that's probably appropriate.
it. So,
One way, if our rates are lower than the competition at this point in time, as far as the user is concerned, they're gonna get an increase in rates. If we sell it, they're gonna get an increase in rates. If we keep it, they're gonna get an increase in rates. Have we seen the benefit of this single operator investment that we have done and all the new equipment that we've purchased in order to do that, the single can pickup or automatic pickup, or it just seems to me that we invested a lot in making that change. Do we now, I guess it has greater value. I don't know, I'm arguing against myself here, but it just seems to me that for the user, they're going to see an increase no matter what.
Well, I'd qualify that. And the reason I'd qualify that statement is that it takes the assembly to increase the rates. So if the assembly decided not to increase the rates, then that's not necessarily the right assumption. If, on the other hand, the assembly does decide that they should increase the rates, make it more comparable what the competition charges, then that's a different story altogether.
Let me make one point from evaluation. When we value a company, unless there is strong evidence that we should look at forward revenue, we are going to look at past revenue, past performance. When you're looking at a Twitter or something that is explosive, you have justification for looking at forward revenue type of projections. I'm not sure you have it in this case because you have history the last 3-5 years at a level, and so a prospective buyer that's going to cost you here is going to be somewhat speculative of their ability to raise rates.
But we just made a substantial investment in equipment, the side pickup, single individual, and theoretically lower costs because we decreased the number of people on the trucks by half.
And you know what, Tim?
And so going forward, that ought to.
You're making a really good point, because when you make that investment, the intent was to be more efficient. But when you look at the actual forecast for expenditures, you can see that the expenditures continue to increase
At the existing rates.
regardless of that efficiency. So probably the cost of the labor is going up at a pace higher than what was achieved in efficiencies.
So I'm going to take a little chairman's credit because Dennis is trying to leave and he knows I have a question for him. Do you mind?
No, actually,
That's why he's trying to-
I wasn't trying to leave, I just had a comment.
Oh, okay, well then.
How do you argue with the chair?
Well, you can do your comment and then
You vote to overrule
I'll
her.
sit quietly for a while.
Oh, okay. Well, with respect to the possibility of rate increases, a couple other variables here. One, solid waste services is a mandatory service area. Okay, so you have a captive audience. Not much prospect for growth unless you see a lot of development in the core area of Anchorage, but if that were not the case, or not mandatory, people could choose to try to get their service elsewhere. In some parts of town, they've had 2 or 3 operators making it go at the same time. You could have an area-wide mandatory service area with a single operator. That operator may, in that scenario, at least at the beginning, have relatively lower rates if they've got a combined service area. But once it's mandatory, they may have the ability to raise those rates and you've got to use the service. So there's some variables there. The RCA could choose to get back into the business of regulating rates to counteract that problem. So you've got some other external things to be thinking about as you look at this.
So I'm sorry, I'm back to taking my, that brings my point up as far as solid waste services is a mandatory service area and the rest of the bowl isn't. And and I'm sure the appraisal or the assessment was done on the mandatory aspect, am I correct?
Just the way your numbers come out, yes.
And my question is, could we sell it still as a mandatory service
Yes.
area? And how is
Well,
that?
let me back up. The statute says that you can create the mandatory service area and you can contract out the services.
Which is,
And
it's not a
So-
sale, it's
so
not
whether
the
you
same.
can-
I'm just.
Outright sales is what I'm looking at.
It's, to me, and I've already voiced this concern, whether we could do that. And because it's a different type of service area than a road service area, fire service area. And so I would like an opinion on that as far as, I mean, and I had the advantage of talking to Dennis about this previously. So you're saying if it's contracted out, if we did something and maybe we should get a,
Did you bring your copy of that?
examples from
Gotcha.
Dennis as far as the 5-year contracting out, what that would look like, because it sounds like that could be mandatory. Anyways, I'll go back to your question.
Okay, it's my turn.
Your turn.
Okay.
I'll forever seal my
So-
lips.
Well,
Through the chair, Mr. Hall, just real quick, the statute says that we can, by ordinance, award contracts for collection and disposal.
Award for,
Award contracts. Now, is that broad enough to include an outright sale? Clearly, you can contract out the service and use private operators to provide service in a contractual relationship with you, but whether or not you can outright sell the asset and have no connection to the service at that point is not clear with that language.
okay, number one, Tim, I understand where you're coming from in regards to, the investment that we made for the equipment to be able to do it. But on the enterprise committee, we've had this discussion, we've had it over and over again, and basically what people anticipate, you become efficient, so you should be able to lower my rates, not increase my rates. I mean, that's the automatic thought that goes with it. And all of that's connected to the fact that we're a government entity. And we've discussed this for more years than we cared or.
even more than years
Yeah.
since you've been on here.
It's an entirely different thing when you have a private sector that owns it and do rate increases. People seldom question it, but when you're government and you do a rate increase, you're gonna get raked over the coals, it's inevitable. So, the analogy that I would kind of come up with what we're looking at here is literally we're sitting here, we've kind of got a bomb in our hands, and the question is how long do we hold on to it before we turn it loose? And I think you're far ahead with the consideration that you're looking at. Just if we can sell this, pick up the kind of number off of it that you are in the range of there, what we end up with is with money that we've got invested, that we can count on what the revenue return on it's going to be. Because we've discussed rate increases, and every time we do, we get there and just, you know, there's nothing positive about us as a government entity looking in and doing a rate increase. It's just hard to do.
Same
Chris?
as
I just had a question on, I think Adam brought up ATU. I think during the dawdling around in the sale of ATU, I think it went around from, going to go from like 500 million down to 250 million. And I think a lot of that was due kind of the deregulation thing that was going on about the same time with GCI. And I think the competitive, you know, the monopoly kind of was disappearing. And so that valuation, so I guess it is relevant in my view as well that the, you know, to what extent does, you know, so if you do sell the solid waste services collection piece, to what extent is that a monopoly, or is it open, you know, open to all comers, anybody who wants to, you know, start picking up, you know, garbage in Anchorage? And I guess if the city controls that, you know, it seems like you're kind of controlling a pretty key component of the ultimate pricing or valuation of that asset. And, you know, maybe you're better off just opening up competition, or, I'm not sure which way it goes, but I know that it had, like with the ATU sale, it had a huge impact, just, you know, that few years. And I'm not sure if it's an analogous situation on the regulatory piece, but to the extent that, you know, the city kind of controls, if the city's holding the cards on, you know, what's regulated, how big the service area is, and it's trying to sell this, you know, the person potentially buying it would be saying, well, you know, how long are you going to preserve that right to, you know, serve that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
As Lucinda mentioned, I live in San Francisco, and I'm fairly, through some of the business organizations, I'm fairly familiar with Recology. Recology is a private-owned company that has been extremely successful on these 5-year contracts in San Francisco. San Francisco is a unique, as everyone knows, a unique town with unique issues. It's probably one of the most well-respected companies now in San Francisco, with a 98% diversion rate from the landfill. They've been extremely successful. They've been so successful they kept waste management out of the city. And they're very involved in the community up there. And the community support for Recology is huge, huge. So the city and Recology have a very close relationship, because the city understands they only want one operator. They want an operator that does a really good job. And that operator reflects the city's values of having 98 to 99% diversion rate. That's important in San Francisco to them, and they've achieved that. And that is a very, very big thing, and the company's making money, and they you know, we see a very good, Recology has done such a good job that they've bounced over now into San Mateo, and they're working up now up in Oregon and in Seattle, that company, and I watch them very closely. I've also been watching Waste Connections. They'll do the same type of thing. They will do these 5-year types of deals, because they are looking for some type of a strong partnership, community development, a relationship in the community type of thing. But we also have seen purchases too. So it's in a lot of ways of what is going to be your goals and your expectations over the next couple of years. San Francisco had expectations of wanting high diversion rates, and they achieved it by working with Recology.
If I might follow. Do you live in San Francisco?
I do. I have a house or a condo up on Knob Hill.
If I might ask, how much is your garbage bill a month?
I don't need.
It's the nearest $100.
Well, let me just say this. Your rates are significantly lower than San Francisco. I know that, because I did check.
Mine's $15.
But I think also, I also have a house in Carmel Valley with waste management, and your rates were slightly lower than waste management's rates at my Carmel house. I did remember checking. But they have over the last, we've had that about 3 years, and every year they increase the rates on our employees there. But San Francisco is a unique, is a very unique, because they put so much emphasis on this diversion from landfill, they are willing to pay a lot more for that. That's a high value issue to them, and that's why the city and Recology have such a very close relationship.
Thank you.
So, with those 5-year contracts, do you see a relatively constant capital investment during that 5 years? I mean, so the maintenance, the system is maybe at least sustaining or maybe appreciating?
Actually, when you put out a bid for these 5 contracts, the either Waste Management or Recology, they actually price in their investment over that 5-year as part of that process, and they expect their investment, whatever they buy new trucks or garbage cans, to basically depreciate over that 5-year. Once the new 5-year comes up, then they'll make another big investment in the thing. So yes, they plan right around how their investment's going to be required. Life of the asset, about 5 years time. They'll plan right around that process.
When you were looking at this, I mean, it's a relatively small service area, would you say? I mean,
Yes, this isn't a, well, as I pointed out to Lucinda, Waste Management is right outside your door, servicing Humpies.
yeah, yeah.
So Alaska Waste is right in your own backyard. It's hard for me sometimes to tell where one line and one line doesn't stop in this town. But I do think, I want to point out really think, one of the things that I see as a true value in SWS, consistent, long-term revenue. You know, that to me, some people will say doesn't have this high growth rate. But I'll counter that. This looks something like a T-bill to me in my mind, because what we're seeing is consistent year-over-year revenue consistently. That should be value to certain buyers wanting low risk, good continuity. So I want to make sure you understand.
And that's with a mandatory service area.
Right. Good, solid revenue stream. That will be a value. It's not popping around a lot.
George, and then
If I
Adam,
could
and
just
then
ask a question. So one way to increase the revenue from the sale, if there was a sale, would basically be to increase the revenue based on the revenue method that you use. Is that correct? So in other words, if you showed that their revenue was higher than it currently is today, then that would yield, or could yield, a higher price for the asset. Is that correct?
Well, if I was going to sell the asset, George, I am certainly going to highlight its ability to make more. I mean, let's frankly, if I'm going to sell your house, I'm going to say it had a pool and another bathroom. Look what you as a buyer can do with this. I'm certainly going to polish it up and make it look that way. How much value does a buyer put on that is debatable, because typically they're going to want to split that increase with you, even at the least, because they're going to have to go out and make that case for the higher price. You can say that that's why I'm saying, when I said be careful, buyers don't put a lot of value on speculative type of increases, especially in an industry like this. You put a lot of value on speculative type things when we come to Twitter and Google and all that, because we know we've seen huge year-over-year growth. I'm just saying these are two different types of things. Yesterday when we put value on NSTAR's pipeline, steady Eddie, same earnings. It's a very, very stable, low margin industry, regulated. You have to pick these assets very, very carefully. They don't have a lot of upside in their industry. That's the only thing I would caution in this thing.
the utility. Adam?
Yeah. Let's assume that the sale does go through, and whatever it is, it's 10 million, 20 million. Is the administration looking at forming, or at least proposing to the assembly, forming some sort of fund that they did with ATU, at which it would go into the market, it would draw earnings off of, that would go into general funds? Is that what we're looking at doing with the proceeds?
Actually, there's several options for the proceeds. That would be one, would be to put it in the trust, we could create a separate fund. Another would be to fund the closure liability at the landfill. I mean, we have a huge liability there.
What is that liability?
33 million,
Yeah.
I believe is the number, and it's been funded for cash, like in the low
Yeah.
millions. So, I mean, that would be an option.
Sure.
But if it sat in that closure fund, it would be earning interest, on that money,
Mhm.
through the cash flow. Yeah, I mean, there's several options. We would have to evaluate all of them.
What's the evaluation process that, obviously there's a risk reward outlook, but is that pretty much, you say, these are our options, what's the greatest risk, what's the greatest reward, and then that's what we're gonna propose?
Right.
Is that how you guys would approach?
Yeah, we would look at the pros and
assembly?
cons for each of the
Okay.
options and the financial situation.
Sure.
I probably would be more likely to say, let's use it for the landfill liability, just because that fund is so underfunded.
Sure.
And because they are related in that,
Yeah.
in terms of the organization and what they do.
Sure. And then one other question is for Dennis, and I don't care to know what your bills are, but from the studies that you have done, how many municipalities, large or small, actually own utilities like this? I mean, we own, the municipality owns AWWU, they own SWS, MLMP. Is that a common trend, or is there a common trend in the market now that government entities are trying to get out of that business because of the liabilities?
The trend, and I focus primarily on the West Coast, the trend is not to be in this business. That's why San Mateo just put out their thing.
Is it because of the liability associated with it? Is it because utilities run by municipalities are generally losing money in the situation?
Think about the buying power just with the cans. If you're waste management and you're buying hundreds of millions of cans, think about the price advantage you're going to have. Or you're buying trucks. So if you're a large organization like Waste Connection, your buying power is huge. You're employing best practices, so you're able to, because of that, able to move your margins up by using those best practices. But one thing I want to really make clear, I want to build up anybody's expectations. The 1 to 2 times revenue is what we're seeing in the market on, for example, my estimation of Alaska Waste acquisition or some other acquisitions as I've got in here. I don't want to build up any expectation as to you're going to get 1 time revenue or 2 times revenue. I don't want to build up that. I'm just saying that's what we're seeing right now. If there is one bidder here for this business, that's going to be on the low side. If there are 100 bidders, you're going to be on the high side. So we have to be. I just want to build. I don't want to build up anybody's expectations. We do this with every owner we talk to when we're about ready to sell the business. Now let's don't build up expectations here. We're going to take this thing out. We're going to put a shiny, sheen on it, and we'll see what the response is. One thing we are seeing is that there is a fairly high level of interest in low risk utility types of property that can last a generation. That is of interest, like roads and bridges and utility type of thing. That is of interest today in the market, and there's money looking for homes in that area because it has a very, very low risk type associated, what I'll call not risk, low volatility associated with it.
And I understand that. And one other thing, I'm sorry, is what is the cost associated? What is it going to cost the municipality just to put it out to bid? To go through this entire process before we even have someone say, I'll pay $5 million for the utility. what's it gonna cost the municipality to do it? Worst case scenario, nobody bids. It sounds like the marketplace is in fact driving in that direction, so I'm not concerned about that, but what is our liability just to do it?
Just the cost to do a sale,
Mhm.
we would, the purchasing department would put out an RFP.
Mhm.
They would manage the process.
Mhm.
We would have to, have data available
Mhm.
for potential buyers. We would have legal costs. We would have, our costs internally in terms of just managing the whole process. We would have the cost associated with employees.
Sure. Is it $1 million, 100,000? Hard to, and if you don't have to answer me right now, I'm just
Yeah.
wondering.
Yeah,
And-
we would look at all that.
And we only have a minute left,
Sure.
and on Tuesday, I'm gonna have to give a report of this committee meeting, and I wanna see if all of you would be comfortable in my report that we met with the administration, we're interested in them pursuing these options, looking into the option, and coming back to us within 2 weeks with some updates on, or if there's any questions, but we'd like the administration to pursue the 3 different options and what that means. Is everybody comfortable with that? 3 options being raising rates, contracting out for 5 years, and selling.
Sure.
And would 2 weeks be enough time to sort of,
I think a month.
a
would be
month?
better.
Okay, a month?
I guess the context that I would like to have it in is how does this benefit the ratepayers or the taxpayers? In other words, and presumably if this goes forward, the ultimate objective is to be a benefit to the taxpayers and the ratepayers in the city. And, if I'm not looking, however that materializes, but I think that should be the context that we're looking at.
I just think also, one last thing, part of that scope, I think, needs to be some sort of information to see if there's any buyers out there that are even interested.
We know
And
that.
to see what,
There are.
and to see what the owners think about it. The owners being the people of Anchorage, because you're gonna hear from folks, businesses and perhaps low-income
Well,
folks
that'll
that
come
see
That will-
increased costs.
That will come back when we go into the public
We're gonna
hearing.
get it anyway.
Yeah. Okay, but otherwise, that will be my report to the committee, that we're expecting some additional information on these.
And so we
3
can
different-
conclude that the do-nothing option is not
I know.
An option.
Everybody understands
Right.
that we
That's
can't
not an
continue.
option.
Right.
Right.
Thank you.